How do you know when it's time to pot up your chili peppers, and why do you even need to pot up your chili peppers in the first place? Today, in episode 3 of my chili pepper growing guide, I'm going to be telling you the answers to those questions, as well as discussing a whole host of other topics to do with potting on. You can find all the timestamps to different chapters below, as well as a link to the previous chili pepper guide videos. If you're a seasoned vegetable or fruit grower, you'll probably be familiar with the idea of potting on, transplanting something into gradually bigger pot sizes. There's a lot of crops that really don't deal well with things like that. A lot of root crops, things like peas for instance, but things like tomatoes and chilies, on the other hand, are going to thrive. My seedlings now are between 3 and 4 weeks old, and normally I might not quite be potting on so early. I'm going to be potting mine on today because a lot of these germinated better than I was expecting. I've sometimes got 2 or 3, or sometimes even 4. There's a gigantic moth hiding in here. Just popped him out in the garden. But those ones are pretty overdue a potting. Generally, your first potting on is going to be a little bit sooner than the rest. For your first potting on, if you're in cells, the simple rule of thumb is once you've got 2 sets of true leaves, it's probably a good idea to start potting up. It depends if you're in cells, like me. I've got a 5x8 cell, so they're quite small cells, so it's going to be a little bit sooner. If you're in trays, which are just full of compost, like this tray of antirrhinums, you're probably going to want to do it after maybe 2 weeks, after they get their first set of true leaves. It can actually be surprising. If I only had 1 pepper in each of those cells, it can be surprising how big they can get in just one of those cells. But because there's so many in there, I need to split them up and divide them. Otherwise, they're going to be competing with each other for the nutrients that are in the compost and the space for their root system. And the longer I leave them, the more those root systems are going to get intertwined. When it comes time to separating them, you're going to damage those root systems. And all of that is time that the plant has spent growing. And chili peppers don't have much time. In the UK, or this kind of growing zone, you're up against the clock. You don't want to set your chili peppers back at all if you can help it. There's not always a set time for when you should pot your peppers on. It's going to be a little bit of getting used to it, same as watering. You've got to kind of spend a bit of time getting used to the signs. The first thing to do is to lift up your tray or lift up your pots and have a look at whether or not there's many roots coming out of the bottom. There's 2 Machu Picchu plants in here. They're looking fairly sizable. I know for a fact these are not going to be running out of space, but they do want to be separated. You can see there are just 1 or 2 roots in here. And this isn't a sign that it needs potting on. You do often get just 1 or 2 of the first roots coming out the bottom of a pot, but if there were a lot more of these, then it's a good sign that the pot has filled up with roots and it's time to get it moved on. The timing is key because if you leave them too long and those roots fill out the pot system, then the plant will start to think that it's run out of space. There's no longer any nutrients for it to find, any space for it to grow into, and it will think, this is it, I'm done here. And what it will do is start to set flower and set seed. It will think it's the end of its lifespan, it's got to reproduce. That's its kind of biological imperative. So if you are seeing flowering at these early stages, that is normally a really bad sign that the plant is either very stressed and thinks its life is coming to an end, or it's run out of space, which is going to be the more common cause. The other warning sign is things like yellowing leaves. There might be some signs of nutrient deficiency, that the nutrients in your compost or your growing media have basically been depleted and the plant is kind of starving for those macronutrients. Do bear in mind that this guide is aimed at relatively kind of beginner or intermediate growers, and it's aimed really for maximum plant size and maximum harvest at the end of the season. So that might not be your goal, and do bear that in mind as we go on. I'm also mainly going to be giving advice on growing in pots as opposed to growing in the ground or a raised bed, because that's what I've done for the last 5 years. I find it much easier, a lot more control. It just works for me. I will be doing a few in the ground this year, but generally, even if you're growing in the ground, a lot of these first concepts and ideas are going to be very relevant because you can't plant into the ground until the risk of frost has completely passed in April, May, wherever your growing zone lets you plant. Let's talk about pot size. This is quite a heated debate, a heated topic. I'm going to be talking to you about my personal recommendations and what's worked for me. I tend to err actually on a slightly smaller pot size than a lot of other growers will recommend. I think that's especially useful for beginners. If you're still getting used to growing peppers, just err on the side of caution and you might get some slightly better plants, I think. I've got here a nice little mix. The first thing that we're going to be potting into today is one of these. This is a 3-inch or a 9-centimeter pot. You don't have to follow these exactly, but you'll get a rough idea. This is a very small pot, and it's just to give them that first little bit of extra feed, extra compost. And then from there, what I recommend is going into something like this, which is a 1-litre pot. Now, we have to talk about space management because this is where it gets very tricky growing indoors. I've got behind me about 50 plants, and when these go into their 3-inch pots, they're gonna have enough room on this shelf. But when you take one of these and put it in here, you start to run out of room quite dramatically. This is gonna take up the space of about 3 of these smaller pots, which is why I gave you all those tips just now about looking for signs that your plant is stressed or has completely run out of room in its growing pot, because the temptation is going to be to leave them in those small pots for as long as you can possibly get away with. I'm going to be potting up today around the beginning of February, which means around the middle of March, I'm going to be expecting to pot them on again. Maybe I could get away with leaving that until the start of April, but I think they're going to be crying out for it. So I need to plan ahead, make sure I've got enough light, enough space to have all of those pots in the house. It might cause a few arguments. If you can supplement it by getting them outside during the day, that can really help, or just putting some on a south-facing windowsill, but it's something to plan ahead for now. And it's something you should really think about when you're sowing your seeds and making sure that you're not sowing too many. And as well, it might be really quite sensible to be culling some of your plants. I've double sown a lot of these, and as much as I would love to keep them, I might end up just putting them into small pots and then giving them away, because I've really struggled to get rid of plants. You never know, some of these might go sideways. They can start off looking really healthy and then they can deteriorate. I think ideally you're aiming to pot up your pepper plants 4 times. Quite often I only do 3, but I think in an ideal world it would be 4. You would go from your cell into your 3-inch pot, then into your 1-inch pot, and then from here into an intermediate. I have a series of 2.5-litre pots, which I sometimes use, I sometimes don't. It all depends on time constraints and that kind of thing. But from there, the 2.5, I would go into my final pot size. Now this is a 5-litre pot, and I would recommend for everyone watching this that this is the smallest pot you would want to aim for. A 5-litre pot can give you a really nicely balanced chili plant. It will be a really nice medium size, and you're going to get earlier harvests as a rule, because the pepper will grow and fill this pot before it will fill a 7.5 or a 10-litre or a 12-litre pot. So this, I think, is actually a really good pot size for beginners. The one up from this is a 7.5. I still today grow a lot of my slower growing varieties, so my chinennes, my really hot plants, in a 7.5-litre pot. And it can give you really good results. The danger is if you start off and you're making a few mistakes, you're not getting the most optimum growth, and then you pot up into a final pot of a 10-litre or a 12-litre, that plant might spend most of summer growing its roots to fill the pot and growing quite slowly above ground. And then when it gets to September, October, the plant isn't going to be ready to set out hundreds and hundreds of chili or pepper pods. One of the things about chili peppers is they do tend to prioritize root growth. You will see them when you pot up. They don't do that much above ground. It takes them a little while to get going, but under the surface, their roots are doing that work. They seem to prioritize the root growth, and then once they've done a bit of that, then they start to put on their vegetation. And that vegetation is really key, because that's what provides all of the energy to the plant. So it's one of the reasons that potting up successive, kind of just giving them a little bit more space, really seems to work for chili plants. This next stage of potting up can be quite a lot of work. It can be a lot of faff, getting everything ready, making the potting mix I'm going to show you, but it is worth it, trust me. Last year, I did a bit of an experiment. I tried to grow a monster chili. I did a whole video that I'll link up here, and I went from, I think, a 1-litre pot into a 30-litre potato tub, you know, those big things with the handles, and I thought it was going to be this massive, great big pepper plant. And I knew all this about the gradual incremental potting up. I did it anyway, and the results were appalling. The plant just kind of sat there. It didn't do anything. It couldn't get its roots away into the pot when I kind of pulled it out at the end of the season. It just hadn't filled it up. It had some growth, but it just doesn't, I just don't think it really works with peppers. It's definitely good to get them on bit by bit. And following that rule of kind of like not potting up more than 4 or 5 times the container size that it's already in, I think works quite well. That's just a little rule of thumb I've got in the back of my head. One of the issues I think is that if you've got a really big container and it's full of water, the plant's roots haven't yet grown into it. It can go a bit stagnant, a bit stale, and I think sometimes you get a bit of root rot. So just follow these steps, do it bit by bit, incrementally, if you want fantastic success. Now the plants are getting older, they need a proper potting mix, so here's the recipe. We're going to start with a slow release fertilizer, some fish blood and bone, and I should say this is Chilli Chump's recipe, links in the description if you want to know more. I'll link his full potting recipe video down in the description. We've got some perlite, this is going to help with drainage and aeration, and then the all important, we've got the Silver Grow compost. I've got a video coming out with a bit more detail about Silver Grow, so do make sure you've liked, subscribed and hit the bell if you do want to see that one in future so you don't miss it. It's going to be really, really interesting. Because Silver Grow has about 10 to 20% coir in it, this time round I've not used vermiculite. If you're just using plain compost, you might want to add vermiculite because that can help act as a bit of a water regulator. It can keep the soil a little bit more moist. Coir acts a bit like a sponge, so I've taken that out of the recipe this time. And just adding the perlite really helps to avoid compaction, especially if you go into a big pot size. The bigger the pot size, the bigger the weight of compost at the bottom of that pot. So perlite really helps to just add that aeration, and it means the roots can grow into it and function correctly and healthily. There is a very light touch of fertilizer in Silver Grow, but it's not very much, so I think adding blood, fish and bone is still the right thing to do at the standard ratio for the recipe. You get a gold star if you notice the mistake I've made here, which is having clumpy blood, fish and bone. I had to go in afterwards and break that up with my hands and make sure it was all properly distributed, so each chili plant was getting its own small dose of fertilizer instead of just 1 or 2 getting all of the feed and possibly getting root burn. And then the final ingredient is a little sprinkle of mycorrhizal fungi. I've not actually used this before, but I've been meaning to for ages. You can see this one came free with some roses, but it doesn't matter, it's all good stuff. And because Silver Grow is very much a wood-based product, it's kind of bark chippings and sawdust and that kind of thing, I think mycorrhizal will really help to break it down and aid in that bioavailability of whatever is in the compost. Now, when it comes to potting on chilies, you pretty much just want to follow all the usual rules. Try and focus on not disturbing the roots too much. If you've got nice container-wise trays like me, it's nice and easy. They've got big gaps in the bottom for you to get your finger in and just lift up. Now, what you do want to do, make sure you don't grab the stem of the plant as you lift up. It's a good reason that we wait a little while until we've got the leaves on here, because as you pull them out, you want to basically hold on to the leaves. They're a lot more robust than the stem. If you give the stem a little squeeze, it can really set the plant back. And one really interesting thing to note, you should be able to see this here, just a little bit of white fuzzy stuff coming out of the stem there. And that is actually new root growth. These are adventitious roots, similar to tomatoes. At this very young stage, chilies will actually readily produce adventitious roots. Some varieties do it more than others, but the fact that chilies do this means that when you come to repot, you can actually repot them quite deep. You can see these aren't quite leggy, but they have grown quite tall. They're an annum variety, which does grow quite tall generally. So sometimes you get tall varieties, they're not always leggy, but these are going to be separated and then can go really deep into the new pot. You can see we've got some really nice healthy root growth on this pair of Korean. These are mild goshu. This is kind of what you want to be seeing when it comes to potting on. If this entire thing is covered in white roots, then it's a good sign that you're looking at something that's getting a bit pot bound or root bound, and you want to avoid that because it's gonna kind of stall your plants a little bit. If they get root bound, then when you pot them on, it's going to take them a little bit longer until they start their growing phase and getting their roots into the right position. Whereas if you get them just at the right time, it's like they catch the ground running. You know, they don't need to slow down, they just carry on going along the path that they were already on. When you're trying to separate two plants like this, it can be very nerve-wracking, but it's one of those things, it's just got to be done. And the best thing to do, just hold the leaves very gently, don't squeeze, and try and give them a little bit of a tap. Let gravity do the work, You'll normally get one that kind of wins, it kind of holds onto most of the soil. It's not perfect, and there's always going to be some damage to these root systems, especially the super fine roots. But you can see both root systems here are intact. There's no roots left over in the soil. So what you then want to do is take your pot and make sure that this is really nicely compressed. You don't want any air gaps. It's really easy to get air gaps early on in this process. Then you can pop your chili pepper in, and you can go down to the level of these, where the first leaves join the stem here. And you can, if you want, take these cotyledons off the plant. These are still quite young, so I'm going to leave mine on and just plant basically up to those. But these will drop off. These will always drop off. So don't worry if you see that happening. You just want to then support your plant, try and get it nice and central in the pot. Fill up the potting mix around it. I like to go right to the top of the pot, and especially if you're using a light mix like this, you can then really compress it down. Not too hard, you don't want to compress it too hard that you squeeze the roots or the stem, but just making sure that there's no air gaps in here. And then the most important part that you absolutely cannot forget, trust me, the label. A few final tips from me now that these guys are back, all potted on in the home, in the office. I'm going to top water these now, and it's one of the few times I recommend top watering because, as I explained in episode 2, bottom watering is great for encouraging root growth, but top watering after you've just potted on is great for pushing out any air bubbles. And you might, if you see the kind of soil level depressed or lower, you might want to compress it and just top it up a little. It could be a really good way of making sure there's no air gaps. The other one is just it sounds kind of silly, but be really, really careful when you're moving these around your house after potting on. The labels now are absolutely crucial. If you misplace the labels, or if you fall or trip and slip and let go of a tray, I've seen it happen so much more than you would expect. So when I'm walking around the house, I've got these like 2 hands, walking really gently, just take no risks, because if you lose all your labels, it can be an absolute nightmare. And a lot of these plants are going to have different requirements as they go on. You know, the slower growing ones are going to go into smaller pots, that kind of thing. We'll talk about that in the future series, but you do not want to lose your labels. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes repotting can be a bit traumatic, and some of the plants will be really dramatic. I can show you one now. This Zimbabwe Black looks like it's on death's door. It really has not enjoyed being repotted, but do not worry if this happens to you. They will perk up. Thank you ever so much for watching. An extra special thank you to all of my Chili Pepper tier patrons: Tony, Bill, Pam, Louise, Mel, Michael, Denise, Socks in the Garden, Andrew and Sarah. Hopefully you found this useful. Any questions, let me know in the comments below, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode.